This was the life of a firefighter in the USA. In 1977, the National Fire Protection Association began tracking on-duty firefighter deaths in the United States for the first time in a systematic, nationwide way. What they found in that first year of data collection was not a number that surprised anyone inside the fire service, but it was a number that the rest of the country rarely thought about. More than 100 firefighters died in the line of duty that year, not in a single catastrophic event, not in a war. One at a time, in structure fires across American cities and towns, in flashovers that turned a room from survivable to unsurvivable in less than 60 seconds, in building collapses that gave no warning before they happened, in cardiac events triggered by the physical demands of dragging hose through a burning building at the age of 52. 100 deaths spread across 52 weeks, across every state, in cities large and small, a toll so steady and so distributed that it never produced a single headline large enough to force a national conversation about why it kept happening. The firefighter of 1977 worked with equipment that was not designed to protect him from the full range of hazards he faced, in buildings that contained materials whose toxicity would not be fully understood for another generation, in a fire environment that was changing in ways that nobody had yet measured or named. He went into burning buildings because that was the job, because the people inside needed help, and because the culture of the American Fire Service in 1977 did not have a robust vocabulary for refusing to enter a structure that was trying to kill you. What was his life actually like? The 23 hours before the alarm went off, and the 60 minutes after. The firehouse was the center of a firefighter's working world in 1977 in a way that had no equivalent in almost any other American profession. The 24-hour shift meant that a firefighter spent a full day and night in the station before going home, eating meals there, sleeping there, maintaining equipment there, and building the specific kind of relationship with his crewmates that only develops between people who depend on each other under extreme conditions. The shift began at 7 or 8 in the morning with the incoming crew relieving the outgoing one. A brief exchange about the previous day's calls, any equipment issues, anything the new crew needed to know. Then came the morning apparatus check. Every piece of equipment on every truck inspected, tested, and confirmed, ready. Hose connections, breathing apparatus, tools, ladders, the engine itself. In 1977, the self-contained breathing apparatus, the SCBA, the device that allows a firefighter to breathe inside a burning building without inhaling the products of combustion, was available in most urban departments but was not always worn consistently at working fires. The culture of the era held that experienced firefighters could read smoke and know when conditions were tolerable without a mask. Some of them were right about that. Some of them developed lung disease in their 40s from the accumulated exposure to smoke they had absorbed across years of working fires without full respiratory protection. Before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. After the apparatus check, the crew moved through the station's daily rhythm, cleaning the living spaces, training on specific skills, inspecting and maintaining equipment, responding to any calls that came in during the day. Fire stations in 1977 were not the purpose-built facilities that many departments occupy today. In cities with aging infrastructure and constrained budgets, the station might be a building that had been in service for 40 years, with equipment that had been purchased a decade earlier, maintained by the crew on whatever budget the city had allocated for parts and supplies. In New York City, The 1975 fiscal crisis had resulted in the closure of multiple fire companies in the outer boroughs, the cancellation of the fire marshal inspection program, and a 70% reduction in fire inspections citywide. The firefighters who remained in service after the layoffs covered territory that had previously been handled by larger forces with the same equipment and fewer people. The South Bronx, a borough that was losing buildings to fire and abandonment at a rate that had no precedent in American urban history, saw 7 entire census tracts lose more than 97% of their structures between 1970 and 1980. The firefighters who worked those stations responded to calls in neighborhoods that were physically disintegrating, where the building they were entering might have been abandoned for months, where the structural integrity of the floor and the stairs was unknown, and where the fire behavior in a gutted, unheated, wind-exposed building was different from anything covered in a standard training curriculum. The structure fire was the defining event of a firefighter's professional life in 1977, the call that separated the work from everything else the job involved. When the alarm came in, the bells dropping in the station, the radio crackling with the dispatcher's address, the crew had seconds to get to the apparatus, pull on their gear, and be rolling before the rig left the bay. The drive to the fire with the engine running code through intersections and around traffic that moved or didn't move, depending on the day, was a period of controlled urgency, during which the officer was already thinking about what the call had said, what the building type was at the address, how many stories, and what occupancy, what the weather was doing. Arriving at a working structure fire in 1977 meant pulling up to a building that was producing visible fire and smoke from at least one point of the structure, with the assignment to put water on the fire and search for any occupants who had not gotten out. The first engine company stretched a line, pulled hose from the truck, connected it to a hydrant or a pumper, and advanced toward the fire. The truck company forced entry if needed, ventilated the building by opening windows or cutting the roof to allow heat and smoke to escape, and searched the structure for victims. All of this happened simultaneously, in coordination, inside a building where the visibility could be measured in inches and the temperature at ceiling level could exceed 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Flashover was the phenomenon that firefighters in 1977 most feared and least understood. It happened when the heat generated by a growing fire raised the temperature of all the combustible materials in a room, the furniture, the wall coverings, the contents, the wood framing, to their simultaneous ignition point. When that threshold was reached, the entire room ignited at once, turning a survivable fire environment into a lethal one in a matter of seconds. Between 1985 and 1994, 47 American firefighters were killed by flashover. The true number for the preceding decade, when understanding of the phenomenon was even less developed, was certainly no smaller. The challenge in 1977 was that there was no reliable early warning system for impending flashover available to the firefighters on the floor. Thermal imaging cameras, which allow a firefighter to see heat signatures through smoke and identify the temperature differentials that predict flashover, did not exist in a form practical for fire service use. The reading of smoke, its color, its movement, its volume and density, was the primary diagnostic tool available, and it required a level of experience and training that varied enormously from one department to another. A firefighter who had been on the job for 15 years in a busy urban house had likely developed a reliable instinct for reading a fire's behavior. A firefighter who had been on the job for 2 years in a department that ran relatively few working fires was operating on training alone, in conditions where the margin for error was measured in seconds. The asbestos problem was not visible to anyone in the American Fire Service in 1977 in the way that it would later be understood to be. Asbestos had been used extensively throughout the construction industry from the 1930s through the late 1970s, appearing in pipe insulation, ceiling tiles, floor tiles, roofing materials, wall compounds, and the fireproofing applied to structural steel in commercial and residential buildings alike. When a building with asbestos-containing materials caught fire, the combustion and the physical disruption of the structure released asbestos fibers into the air, into exactly the smoke and superheated atmosphere that firefighters were working in. Every firefighter who entered a burning building that contained asbestos, particularly after a roof or floor had collapsed and the materials had been disturbed, was potentially inhaling asbestos fibers. The fibers were invisible. The SCBA, when it was worn, offered some protection. When it was not worn, during overhaul operations, during the search of a building after the fire was knocked down, during the extended periods of working in smoke-filled environments that fell below the threshold that triggered mask use in the culture of the era, the exposure was direct and unprotected. The mesothelioma and lung cancers that would appear in retired firefighters through the 1990s and beyond were the delayed accounting for what had been inhaled decades earlier. The physical demands of firefighting in 1977 were substantial and cumulative in ways that the medical understanding of the era did not fully account for. A firefighter advancing a charged hose line through a building was dragging and controlling a water-filled hose that could weigh more than 50 pounds per 50-foot section in full protective gear and breathing apparatus, in ambient temperatures that range from uncomfortable to survivable but extreme. The cardiovascular demands of that activity, sustained for periods that could run to 30 or 40 minutes before relief was possible, placed enormous stress on the heart. Sudden cardiac death has been, since the NFPA began tracking data in 1977, the single largest cause of on-duty firefighter fatalities in the United States, accounting for roughly half of all line-of-duty deaths in most years. In 1977, the connection between the physiological stress of firefighting and cardiac risk was understood in general terms, but not yet the subject of the systematic medical screening and fitness programs that would develop in subsequent decades. Men who had pre-existing cardiac conditions that had not been diagnosed, men who were carrying significant cardiovascular risk factors that had not been addressed, were going into burning buildings and experiencing the full physiological demand of the work without any baseline assessment of whether their hearts could handle it. The firehouse culture of 1977 was a culture built around proximity, reliability, and the specific bond that forms between people who sleep under the same roof and go into danger together. Firefighters ate together, cleaned together, trained together, and spent more consecutive waking hours with their crewmates during a tour than with their own families. The relationships that formed in that environment were among the closest that working life in America produced, a fact that had significant positive consequences for how crews function under stress and significant complications for how they process the psychological effects of what they witnessed. The fire service of 1977 did not have a developed approach to occupational mental health. The concept that witnessing traumatic events repeatedly across a career could produce cumulative psychological damage, what would later be identified as post-traumatic stress, and later still recognized as a specific occupational health risk in emergency services, was not part of the official vocabulary of any fire department in the country. Men who were struggling with what they had seen, what they had been unable to prevent, what they carried home from a bad fire, handled it the way their culture prescribed. They didn't talk about it, or they talked about it only with the people who had been there, in terms that stayed inside the firehouse. The 1977 firefighter did his work at a specific and underappreciated moment in the history of the built environment. The synthetic materials that had come into widespread use in American construction and furnishing through the 1960s and 70s, polyurethane foam in furniture, vinyl flooring, plastic wall coverings, synthetic carpeting, burned differently than the natural materials they had replaced. They burned hotter. They burned faster. They produced combustion gases, including hydrogen cyanide and other toxic compounds that were significantly more dangerous to inhale than the products of burning wood and cotton. The time from ignition to flashover in a room furnished with modern, synthetic materials was measurably shorter than in a room furnished in the style of a generation earlier. The fire that a firefighter in 1977 entered was in some respects a more dangerous fire than the one his father had entered a generation before, not because of anything the fire service had done differently, but because the building contents had changed in ways that nobody had tracked or flagged as a safety issue until the data began to accumulate in the form of firefighter deaths. The men who worked the firehouses of America in 1977 were doing a job that the public broadly admired and rarely examined in detail. The admiration was genuine. Firefighting has been understood as dangerous and selfless since long before any systematic data confirmed that understanding. What the public did not see, because it happened slowly and invisibly over the course of careers rather than dramatically in the middle of a working fire, was the cost that the work extracted from the bodies of the men who did it. The lungs damaged by decades of smoke exposure and asbestos inhalation. The hearts strained by years of extreme cardiovascular demand without adequate medical monitoring. The minds carrying the weight of what had been witnessed across thousands of responses without any formal support for processing it. The improvements that came in subsequent decades, mandatory SCBA use at working fires, systematic cancer screening, mental health programs, better protective gear, thermal imaging technology, were built directly on the evidence produced by the men who worked without those protections in 1977 and earlier. Their deaths and their illnesses were not wasted. They were the data that made the case for change. It took a long time, and it cost a great deal, before the fire service developed the systematic approach to protecting its own people that it had always applied to protecting everyone else. The specific geography of fire risk in 1977 America was not evenly distributed. Urban departments in cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia ran far more working structural fires per company per year than departments in smaller cities or suburban jurisdictions. A firefighter assigned to a busy engine company in the South Bronx or Chicago's West Side in 1977 might see more working fires in a single month than a firefighter in a mid-sized suburban department would see in a year. That volume produced experience and competence at a rate that quieter assignments could not replicate. But it also produced cumulative exposure to smoke, to the products of combustion, to the psychological weight of repeated traumatic events, at a rate that the medical understanding of the era could not adequately measure or address. The firefighters who worked the busiest houses in the highest fire cities of 1977 were, in measurable ways, burning through their bodies faster than their colleagues in lower volume departments, and the occupational health infrastructure of the era did not recognize that differential or account for it in any systematic way. Retirement came at the same age for all of them. The medical consequences arrived earlier for some. The connection between the two facts was not formally established until long after the men who had lived it had retired or died or both. The relationship between a firefighter and his protective gear in 1977 was different from what it would become in subsequent decades, and the difference was not simply technical. The bunker gear, the heavy coat and pants that provided thermal protection, of the era was significantly less effective than what modern firefighters wear. It was heavier, less flexible, and offered less protection against radiant heat and steam burns. The boots were rubber, providing reasonable protection against water, but limited protection against the thermal environment at the floor level of a working fire. The helmet was designed primarily to protect against falling objects and provided some heat resistance, but was not integrated into a system designed around total thermal protection the way modern ensemble gear is engineered. A firefighter in 1977 who made entry into a room with a developing fire was better protected than a firefighter of 20 years earlier, and significantly less protected than a firefighter of 20 years later. He knew the gear was not perfect. He went in anyway because the alarm had come in, the truck was at the curb, and there was someone inside who needed help. That calculation, imperfect equipment, clear mission, no hesitation, was the defining characteristic of the American firefighter in 1977. And it was both the source of his effectiveness and a partial explanation for why the line-of-duty death toll remained as high as it did. The 1977 firefighter existed at an intersection of two realities that pulled in opposite directions. The public image of firefighting, the courage, the selflessness, the run toward danger that ordinary people run away from, was as clear and as admired in 1977 as it had ever been. The actual occupational reality, the inadequate protective technology, the toxic exposures that would not be counted for decades, the psychological weight carried without support, the cardiac risk that claimed as many firefighters as the fire itself, was almost entirely invisible to the same public that held the profession in such high regard. Closing that gap between image and reality has been the work of the fire service's occupational health and safety advocates across the decades since 1977, and it remains unfinished. The firefighters who died in the line of duty that year, and in the years immediately before and after, made the case for change through the specificity of what happened to them, not through advocacy or argument, but through the accumulated evidence of how the job was killing people that the data could not ignore once someone began collecting it carefully enough. The NFPA's decision to begin systematic tracking in 1977 was not a coincidence. It was a recognition that the deaths had to be counted before they could be reduced.